Good evening, everyone.
Good evening.
Welcome to the Chilliwack Museum and Archives. My name is Matthew Francis. I'm the executive director here. And it's really a pleasure to welcome all of you here on a nice rainy evening in Chilliwack. And this event is held in conjunction with BC Heritage Week, which we are celebrating this week. So this is essentially a wrap-up event for BC Heritage Week. And we're celebrating as part of this provincial focus on heritage and historic places on this year on distinctive destinations. Well, this place is certainly a distinctive destination. Of course, now it's home to the Chilliwack Museum and Archives. We've been delighted to be here operating the museum and archives from this building since 1987. But previous to that, of course, it had a prehistory as, of course, City Hall. And it is a National Historic Site of Canada, and we're going to hear a little bit more about the history of this place. But first, I'd like to introduce our keynote speaker for this evening, Donald Luxton. So, of course, we're delighted to have you here, Donald, tonight. And I'll just give a little bit of an intro to you for folks that are here this evening. And I'll just let you know we'll have the presentation, and then at the end of the presentation, there will be a little bit of time for questions. If you have any questions on tonight's presentation, Donald will be happy to respond to those. Donald Luxton is one of the leading figures in Canada's heritage conservation movement today. An esteemed consultant and architectural historian, some days Don might be found atop a 30-foot ladder, reaching under a dormer, scalpel in hand, to acquire some paint samples from an Edwardian house perhaps, and then later that same day he might be presenting to a city council or teaching the next generation of heritage leaders. Don was trained at the University of British Columbia in fine arts and architecture and has worked ever since in the field of heritage conservation and serves as principal of his own consulting firm, Donald Luxton Associates, with offices in Vancouver and Calgary. And it was in this capacity that I first met Donald over a decade ago as he was developing municipal heritage management plans, I think for the city of Red Deer at that time. And the guy who was my boss used to work for Don. So that's kind of the connection. And so for several years we had the pleasure of running into each other in boardrooms and urban and rural city halls across Alberta. And I can say that I learned a lot from watching Don and his team at work. And back in 1991, Donald prepared the heritage inventory for the district of Chilliwack. And most recently in the field of heritage planning, Donald's firm is just wrapping up preparation of the City of Vancouver's Heritage Action Plan. Don is also an award-winning author with titles such as Lion's Gate and Building the West, the architects of early British Columbia, to his credit. He's highly regarded in his field as a member of the College of Fellows of the Royal Architectural Institute of Canada, and just last night Donald received 5 awards from Heritage British Columbia, including Heritage BC's Award of Honor for his firm's role in the conservation of the Japanese-Canadian War Memorial in the Stanley Park National Historic Site. All that said, yes. Congrats, Don. All that said, Donald is here tonight to share with us his decades-long enthusiasm for the work of Thomas Hooper, in whose building we gather here tonight. So please join me in welcoming back to Chilliwack, Donald Luxton.
Can't be me. I'm not that old, right? It can't be. Can't be. Thank you, Matthew. Really appreciate that introduction, and some of it might be true. Yes. It's really a pleasure to be here tonight. Happy Heritage Week, everyone. This is the week where we celebrate heritage and distinctive destinations. And so Matthew asked me, he said, would you be willing to do a talk on Thomas Hooper during Heritage Week? And I went, oh, sure, that'd be a great idea. And then I stopped after I said yes to think about it. And it kind of scared me because I realized that there's so much material, there's so much to talk about. It's been over 30 years of research on this one architect that I have in boxes and filing cabinets and squirreled away somewhere on my laptop, and it's not all pulled together. So it's like, to give a coherent talk, I had to really start to think about what I had collected over that period of time. And Thomas Hooper was a fascinating character, yes and no. He was a fascinating architect, but his life, as you'll hear, is relatively, he worked a lot. That's what he did. Designed an enormous number of buildings. And as it turned out, of course, he had prior to the First World War, he had the largest architectural firm in Western Canada. Nobody really knows about him, though. And there's reasons for that, as I'll explain. Many years ago, when I first started in the heritage field back in the early 1980s, we were doing a lot of inventory work in different municipalities, and I was starting to collect files on architects. There was not a lot of information around on individual architects at that point. There was a book on Samuel McClure. There were a couple of books on Francis Rattenbury, and that's where it stopped. And so as I was keeping these files on architects, there was one file that kept growing and growing and growing, and it was Hooper, or in his partnership as Hooper and Watkins. And so I got very interested. It became kind of a personal quest to find out more about this fellow. And I'll explain a connection later. But I got very interested, so I actually asked around, and finally somehow I made a connection to a family member who was still alive at that time. And one thing led to another, and a family tree was sent to me, and some people started talking to me about Thomas Hooper, and very few people were around that had actually met him or knew him at the time. Fragments of photographs and notes turned up, a few things turned up from the family, but I am so glad I did that research in the 80s because they're all gone now. And so that was the basis of building the information on Hooper. So what I will be showing you tonight are things that have not been seen in public since that time. I had to dig them out, thank you, Matthew, and get them in a digital format because many of them were copy negatives and things. It's just like, we're talking over 30 years ago, right? So there was a lot that I collected at that point. And then over time, as I was getting more and more interested in his career, there was a lot of information that started turning up on buildings, and more buildings, and more, and hundreds. And so this incredibly prolific architect who nobody kind of knew about was becoming very interesting to me, and it was the genesis, really, of the book Building the West, where I had my guy, and there were a whole bunch of people around that had their guy that they were interested in too. So somebody was doing Thomas Sorby, somebody was doing Maxwell Muir in Victoria, and all of a sudden we had this little club of people who were interested in great dead white male architects, which was the actual working title of the book for many years. So it was either that or shh, they're only sleeping. So we all got interested in our own architects, and then we kind of kept going. And I had a conversation on the phone in 1992 with Stuart Stark from Victoria, and he was working on an architect called John Gerhard Tiarks. And so I said, Stuart, why don't we just all write up our guy, and we can do a little book, and it'll be done in 6 months. And we phoned everybody, and we got a group of people together. And it was a project that ultimately took 11 years and 58 people. Building the West is a doorstop. But it was the first time that we had surveyed the architectural profession in BC. And Hooper was my guy from day one, and always was. And so I embarked on a journey to understand this architect in the best way possible. And of course, when I was starting to collect information in the early 1980s, it was to produce a book on Thomas Hooper, which has never happened yet. So I think this talk is part of the journey. The first time I've ever presented this material, so I'm thrilled to have such a great audience for it. I'm absolutely delighted. So it's a pleasure to be in the Chilliwack Museum and Archives, and also in a Thomas Hooper building presenting this. So I'll take you, there's a ton of material, and I've tried to distill it down as best I can. I'm going to race through a lot of stuff, and I'm happy to answer questions later, but I'm just going to try and give you sort of a flavor and a taste of what I've gone through to find this information and what there is out there. So the life of Hooper was an interesting one because, of course, he is so typical of those 400 architects that we wrote about who came from somewhere and moved around to find opportunity and ended up at the end of the line, basically. And Hooper was no different, and he is typical of the system that of Great Britain that spewed out a number of people because the population was just expanding, and it was expanding for many reasons. Sanitation was improving more than anything else, so children were living longer, and if you had 12 children, 10 of them might survive all of a sudden, not 3 or 4, and all of a sudden families were bigger. What do you do with them all? There just aren't the opportunities, and the eldest son would get the opportunity. He would take over the family business or get the property or the farm. What about the other 11 kids? Where are they going to go? Well, they're going to go to Australia or Canada or South Africa. They're going to go somewhere. So we see this incredible diaspora of people, including professionals. And they were moving into an area here that did not have professionals. So the people that were the early architects and surveyors and engineers in British Columbia were all from Great Britain, almost invariably. So, which is why we called the book, as the working title, Great Dead White Male British Architects, because that's exactly what it was. We had 400 architects that kind of followed that mode, and two nuns. So it was very much a male profession. Hooper was trained in that profession. His family, his 2 uncles were architects in the Duchy of Cornwall. So this started with a search for the Hoopers, for me, to try and find information when it wasn't in one place, believe me. Hooper was born in a town called Hatherley in Devon. I'll show you that as we go through the material. In 1857. He was the one of 11 children. His family didn't have a lot of opportunity. Again, his father was not the eldest son, so kind of ended up he was postmaster and did a few things, but there wasn't a lot of opportunity. So they left for Canada, 1871, at the time of Confederation. They ended up in London, Ontario, which was one trip. My poor long-suffering partner had to go to London with me. That was the first one of many trips, but then the Hoopers didn't really kind of settle in there. It was already kind of settled out in many ways. So they moved west, and they moved west in anticipation of the railway. So they ended up in a place called Emerson, which was the boom town at the time. Another field trip. Yet more cemeteries, yet more digging. Not digging, literally, but digging. And Emerson was the boom town. I'll show you that in a minute. But it was anticipated that when the CPR came through, it would come through Emerson. It's right on the border, and there was a route coming up from the States that would have crossed it right there. So everybody thought Emerson would just become the next Toronto. Well, surprise, the CPR went through Winnipeg instead. So Thomas Hooper and 2 of his brothers moved to Winnipeg, where he worked with one, and it's another story. As the CPR moved west, clearly that's where the opportunity was going to be. So Hooper apocryphally said that he walked the last 500 miles to the coast to be in Vancouver in advance of the railway, and he arrived right after the Great Fire, like the month after the Great Fire in Vancouver. So what a great opportunity for an architect. He had his first commission for the Methodist Church in Vancouver, and then he got his big break, as I'll explain, in Victoria in 1889, and worked back and forth between both cities, but then technically was really based in Victoria for most of the next period of his career. So he was in BC when it hit the big boom, the really big boom, not just the Klondike boom, but the big Edwardian era boom, which is when he made his reputation and one of his fortunes. He claimed to have made and lost 4 fortunes. When the bust hit, 1913 to 1914, and his business collapsed completely, he took off for New York. And we don't know much of what happened there. We don't think he did much. We think he coasted for many years, and he ended up coming back to Vancouver in 1927, we think when the money ran out, and continued to work until his health gave out, and he died in 1935, buried in an unmarked grave. Not unusual in 1935. No one had money for headstones. His family looked after him. His family was incredibly close and important, and fortunately I caught the tail end of the people that knew him when he was still alive, so heard lots of stories about him. He was kind of famous in the family because he was just so well known, but people didn't know him. He traveled a lot and went to New York a lot, and etc. So this was the search for the Hoopers, a collage put together by one of his relatives of family photographs of various people, and there's Hoop down there on the bottom with his little goatee. But it all starts in Hatherley. Hatherley is in Devon, kind of in the middle of nowhere. It's a medieval doomsday town, a market town, and it's remote. And you have to understand, of course, that to get there, there's no train that goes there. There's this little one-car roads, stone fences, very, very, very remote. So you go to Hatherley, and there's the church, the 900-year-old church, and the churchyard, and the quaint little houses, and that's about what Hatherley is all about. All of the family members that I met had said, just go to Hatherley, you'll get it. You'll understand it. Go to the Bridge Pub and the Bridge Inn. Talk to the manager of the Bridge Pub, and you'll hear lots of stories. And I went, okay, fine, I will do this. So I went to Hatherley, and I went to the Bridge Inn, and I talked to the guy behind the bar, and I said, my name's Don Luxton, and I would like to research the Hooper family. And he looked at me and said, I'll get the manager. Okay, this is good. The manager came out and looked at me with a very suspicious look, and he said, what's your name? And I said, Don Luxton, I'm here to research the Hooper family. He said, what about your family? And I said, I don't care. I'm here to talk about the Hoopers. And I got this very strange look. And he told me, okay, well, tomorrow you go to such and such an address, you knock on the door, the local historian there, she'll help you. So I did that the next day, knocked on her door, and a very nice elderly woman who was making bread at the time, covered in flour, gave me the same kind of look. And so we talked, and she pulled out some really interesting material and promised to send more, and she did, and it was wonderful material, just really rich material, wonderful stuff. And she said, before you go, you better go look in the graveyard. I said, really? And I said, yes. And she said, yeah, you'll learn quite a bit there. So I went and wandered to the graveyard, and there were all the Hoopers going back hundreds of years, of course, as one would expect, because people didn't move around hundreds of years ago. They were born and died in the same town, right beside the Luxtons. And so, no, I wasn't interested in my family. So that was very unusual. And then when I came back to Canada, I learned that the last of the Luxtons had become extinct in Hatherley in a spectacular murder-suicide that was the subject of a best-selling crime book and a BBC drama. No, I wasn't interested in my family. quite the shock. But what I did learn, and I've had certainly hints of it ever since, I'm related in some way. Who knows what degree or whatever, but the two families were intermarried for hundreds of years and knew each other in Canada. Go figure. So where did my interest in Thomas Hooper come from? The ether somewhere. Anyway. But this was also very convenient because I could now do some research on my own family, and my grandfather came from exactly this area, which I had no idea. All the Luxtons came from here. So my psychic connection to Thomas Hooper was now complete. So just very quickly to run through the background, he was the sixth of 11 children of John and Susan or Susanna Hooper. They were married in 1847, moved to Canada in 1871. There's not a lot that I've been able to find about their life in Hatherley. There's not a lot I've been able to find in London. But Emerson was more fertile territory because both John and Susanna died in Emerson, and many of the family lived in Emerson, despite the fact that it never boomed and never actually became the city that it was planned. Here it is in 1880s. They were really planning on a big grand city. Well, that never really got there. It just kind of boomed slightly and didn't happen. But it was interesting because many of the Hooper family actually did stay there. This is their log cabin, a photo taken about 1891, but the building would date from about the time of their arrival, and kind of loved the shot. You know, we know who all the people are, actually. The family that I was able to contact were great. They gave me annotated notes and photos and all kinds of things. So this is frontier life, and these were the family members that stayed actually in Emerson. There's John Hooper and three of his sons. Not sure who the one on the left is, but of course Thomas Hooper right here. And his brother Samuel Hooper was also, we understand that they would both have trained as architects, builders, contractors in England, and they worked in that capacity in some extent in London, but certainly by the time they hit Emerson, they were working in the field of architecture. Samuel went on to become the provincial architect of Manitoba. And that's Sam, that's Thomas, that's John. And there's Susan Hooper with three of the daughters. And I think this photograph undoubtedly dates from when they were in Canada. Here they are in Vancouver, complete with dog. The family was kind of spread out. There was Vancouver branch and the Manitoba branch. And there's Susan again with one of her daughters. Thomas married Rebecca Johnston in 1879 in Emerson. Her sister married one of his brothers as well, a double wedding kind of thing. They had a child who lived only 4 months, and it's the only child they ever had. Very tragic, buried in Emerson. There's a family photo, tenant family wedding in Vancouver, and right there, here's Thomas, and there's Rebecca Hooper. I think this is the only photo I have of Rebecca. They're very scant information, and surprisingly few photographs that actually show Thomas. For somebody so prominent in the profession, it's bizarre how little information there is. However, if I ever do write a book about Hooper, I'd at least have a scandal. I might be able to sell some books. There is, it's the only thing that does, really. Let's be honest. He was accused by one of the Methodist missionaries of fathering a child on one of his numerous trips up the coast in 1897, and we've been trying to track that person who does seem to have existed. So Mr. Hooper was not quite as Methodist and pure as you might think. At least one indiscretion that we know of. There were a few showgirls too. Okay. But his career, I mean, his life was, again, very much that of the pioneer of the West, and it's the way it played out. But his career was fascinating. For someone who you would not peg at the beginning of, he was a slow starter. You wouldn't peg him as someone who would end up with such an incredible practice. He apprenticed as a carpenter and joiner in London for 4 years. When he moved to Emerson and then to Winnipeg, he was a carpenter and contractor, but also billed himself as an architect. And you have to remember, at the time, anybody could call themselves an architect. There was no professional registration. So if you felt you were qualified and you could get away with it, that's what you billed yourself as. He moved to Winnipeg when the CPR arrived, and as did his brother, and him and Samuel worked together for a while as Hooper and Hooper. But Thomas was restless, didn't see that this was going to be the end game for him. So when he moved to BC, he actually got a job as a provincial supervisory architect for a short period of time, but his private practice was established and took off. In 1890 to 91, very briefly, he was in partnership with Samuel May Goddard. Didn't last. Goddard left looking for other opportunities. But in 1890, he also hired a man named C. Elwood Watkin, who became later his partner. And C. Elwood Watkins was instrumental in getting his practice up and running. He was a very gifted, very talented guy, worked under Hooper for years, and eventually just slid into partnership when he became older and as the workload expanded. Watkins tended to stay in Victoria. Hooper was back and forth to Vancouver a lot. The partnership ended over quite acrimoniously and unfortunately, and as I understand it, over money, as they usually do. And Hooper then spun off his practice into, again, the largest architectural practice in Western Canada. Watkins stayed in Victoria and had a very successful but modest career. We have no idea if Hooper actually designed anything in New York once he left in 1915, but he was gone for 12 years. When he came back and tried to get reestablished, he went into partnership with one of his previous employees, Robert Wilson. Practiced for a couple of years and really ran out of steam. The kind of career arc that happened. One of the reasons it's so hard to dig out this material is Hooper didn't have any children that survived, and none of the records of his office survived. So we're really putting together a jigsaw puzzle from pieces. So the first building that we can definitively identify that Hooper did is an immigration hut in Emerson that was built at the time just before the CPR was anticipated to come through, and it was to basically to hold individuals coming up from the States in just until they could be processed. And that's why the separate outhouses were provided. People were actually expected to be living there. This comes from the National Archives. And it's wonderful when you're digging out certain things. The government doesn't actually throw a lot of stuff out. It's surprising, but finding it is never easy, and this was a random hit. Assigned by Thomas Hooper, architect in Emerson. So that really pegs the start of his career. Here's Hooper in the 1890s, dapper fellow, very dapper mustache. And so at this point, he would be working in both Vancouver and Victoria. His big break in Vancouver was being chosen by the Methodists to design the Homer Street Methodist Church in 1888 to 89. To put that in context, the city had burned to the ground in 1886. 1887, the railway had arrived on May 23rd, and Hooper was sitting there waiting to catch work, as they all were. There is nothing better for architects than the fire. And most cities had them because, of course, they weren't fireproof in the way that we would expect buildings to be now. So the city was leveled, so they were starting off, and at the same time, around the city, as people were flooding now in once the railway arrived, you can just imagine how fast things are starting to happen. There were institutions being built all over the city. So when he was provincial supervisory architect, he was looking after schools, he was starting to do churches, and he worked over his career for every faith that you can imagine, Catholics and Anglicans and Baptists, and he did synagogues, he did everything, right? Because you did, and that's what you did. And he was a trusted and respected builder and estimator. That's what people really said he was good at, that he was one of the best at actually really scoping out projects. So he designed this building, the Homer Street Methodist. It's located at what is now 411 Dunsmuir in downtown Vancouver, across from kind of kitty corner to Holy Rosary Cathedral. But this building put him in touch with Thomas Crosby and the Methodist Mafia, and oh boy, did things take off after that. So he did very well on this and ingratiated himself to the Methodists, and they were thrilled with this building, and it led to the next really plum commission in Victoria. Hooper was chosen to design the Metropolitan Methodist Church, which is still there. It's on Quadra Street. It's now the Victoria Academy of Music. What was important about this building was the Methodists thought it was really important that they have the most up-to-date building you could possibly get. So they put Hooper and his wife on a train and sent them back east. They went to Toronto, they went to Philadelphia, and he learned so much about what was happening at that time in those cities because they were booming, and that's when Henry Hobson Richardson and the whole revival of the Romanesque was happening. These were new, exciting ideas, and he brought these back to the coast. So he was all of a sudden at the advanced edge of the profession on the coast. So you note that we have not Gothic pointed arches on this building, we have rounded arches, Romanesque. He was directly quoting what he had been seeing back east, the rock-pitched masonry, massive masonry buildings. And so this was the start of his stylistic exploration of the Romanesque styles now at the end of the Victorian era. So he wasn't just designing churches, he was doing buildings like the YMCA in Vancouver, 1890 to 93. And again, you note the round arches, the very heavy masonry, the big arched entry. These are now hallmarks of the style, and Hooper's leading the way. However, he never lost that core work with the Methodists, and so he was up and down the coast doing Indian mission schools. This is one in Port Simpson he designed when he was working with Samuel May Goddard. And you can see these big institutional buildings were something he was obviously very comfortable with. In 1892 to 3, he was chosen to and built the Cridge Protestant Orphanage, and there we are at the laying of the cornerstone, and there's Mr. Hooper in his smart kind of ice cream suit and bowler hat right there. Again, one of the few photos we have of him. There's startlingly few photographs of Hooper. So he was all over the province. Vernon, he designed a Methodist church, 1892 to 3, and clearly that was the core of his work, and that's what actually then brought him to Chilliwack in 1893 for the first time. Kokalitsa Institute, there's the cornerstone, which is still there, but certainly the building is not, although I'm sure you all know the site. This was the largest residential school, Indian residential school in the province when it was built. So this was a big commission, and it kicked off, and this was what was really interesting when Matthew mentioned the inventory we did back in 1990 to 91. At that point, I was just astonished to see how many sites Hooper had worked on in Chilliwack. And it was partly the connections that he made through doing Kokalitsa, partly the connections to the Methodists, and the fact that he was known, and the fact that he was willing to travel. And that was one of the things that was clear throughout his career, that he was not afraid to get on a horse, a train, a boat, or whatever to get work. And that's why probably his personal life was probably pretty boring. He's probably what you would consider today to be pretty much a workaholic. He worked a lot, and he worked all the time, and he worked all over the place at a time when it wasn't that easy to get around. And we have to kind of think back to coming to Chilliwack in 1893 to supervise a building of this scale. Not so easy. He also designed other buildings on the site in addition to the buildings. This was the director's house, which we understand probably dated from about 1896. But his practice in Victoria, which was the core of his practice, was thriving. And so we see throughout this time period, Hooper is as prolific as anyone working in the city, including this building, a residence for A.G. Black in 1895, very much intact, just south of the Parliament buildings, just recently moved around as part of a new development, but being preserved. And we have a little bit of evidence of what that house originally looked at. High Victorian, big wraparound verandas, etc., complete with all the stained glass and all the details and all the stuff you would expect in a very high Victorian building. So we're now up to 1895 to 96. In 1898, he designs the original part, this part, of Carmen Methodist Church. And highly unusual building. I don't know where they pulled this one out of. I love it, but it's an unusual building with this large round turret. I have no idea what that has to do with Methodists. With the big holes in the roof, so I guess you can look out. That's the belfry, right? So you could, obviously it's a very unusual belfry. And that's actually a Sunday school that Hooper and Watkins added in 1908. In 1926, after church union, it became a united church, and it was actually cut in half and moved up to Vetter Road, and then ultimately demolished in the 50s. But really quite extraordinary. People actually moved buildings a lot more than we do today. We were very quick to tear things down, but the investment in labor and materials was so substantial that you didn't tear things down lightly. So at this point, by the end of the 19th century, beginning of the 20th century, Hooper was doing well. By then, he had certainly made the first of his fortunes. And he built himself a lovely house in Victoria called Hatherley, no surprise, which still exists. It's been altered, but it is still there, and this really demonstrated his success in the profession. So, really wonderful house. In 1902, here's C. Elwood Watkins becomes his partner, and these are kind of the golden years of Hooper's really collaboration and practice. And I think Watkins was really instrumental in getting a lot of these projects built. Hooper's out, talking to a lot of people, doing a lot of work. Watkins is back at the office, and his very distinctive handwriting on the plans is really obvious. So they start cranking it out. Now this is when things really start booming in British Columbia. Lots of money sloshing around, and so by 1904 this house called Stonehaven is being built for a contractor that did a lot of Hooper's projects, George Snyder. And this shows the opulence and the money that was available. These grand houses just being, there's a very rare interior photograph, but this is what you would expect to see for someone who's successful in the early 1900s. But other things, speaking of National Historic Sites, Hooper and Watkins also designed the Rogers Chocolate Shop in Victoria, which is still very much intact. It's wonderful Edwardian era interior. If you ever want to really see what these interiors look like, that's a fantastic place to visit. And in 1904, Hooper and Watkins won the competition to design the Carnegie Library in Victoria. Again, you'll see that very characteristic Romanesque rounded arch being used, and that building, of course, still exists today on Yates Street at Blanchard. They did an enormous amount of work for the Royal Bank as well, and this is, you may know Munro's books on Government Street in Victoria. That was originally the Royal Bank, designed by Hooper and Watkins, and part of a very interesting, almost marketing and branding exercise that the bank was going through at the time. They hired very well-known New York architects Carrere and Hastings to design the fronts of the buildings in a number of cases, and this was one of them. We've actually found in the Royal Bank archives the invoice from Carrere and Hastings for this building. But you'll see the shift now. All of a sudden we're seeing classical columns. All of a sudden taste is changing, things are starting to morph, and the Victorian styles are starting to go out of fashion, and the classical styles are starting to come in, and on certain commissions we see that showing up. So continuing that Methodist work, of course, was the church that stood across the street, 1908 to 9, a Hooper and Watkins project, and the building we're in 1910. So the interesting thing about this building was it appears that Hooper was chosen. There was no competition, and he there's many accounts now that we can search the progress online and get at the information more easily than we could before. What a gift that is. I mean, it's amazing for researchers. We were able to see the almost the very regular sort of monthly visits of Hooper every time he showed up in town. It's mentioned in the progress, and clearly a building he was very proud of. What is really interesting is we've morphed directly into the classical revival with this building. And you can see that Hooper's embraced this, and I'll talk more about that because this starts happening very quickly now with his buildings. This is just after the split with Watkins. Clearly, Hooper is supervising this project personally as it's proceeding. At the same time, of course, there's a lot of other work going on in the office, and he had a series of clients that he continued to work for decades. One of them was E.A. Morris, the tobacconist, and again in Victoria, if you ever want to see a slice of what the Edwardian era looked like, the interior of that shop is intact, complete with its onyx gasolier where you could light your cigar as you bought it, and the humidor at the back. It's all there. It's still there. Quite remarkable. He designed for everything Morris ever built. He designed for R.V. Winch, everything he ever built. And there was a connection to the Spencer family, David Spencer of David Spencer Stores, and Spencer's son, Chris. Chris Spencer and Hooper ended up being extremely good friends, and whenever Chris Spencer went overseas on buying trips, he took Hoop along with him, which is where the story of the Chorus Girls comes in. But anyway, that's another story. In 1910, Hooper was really hitting his stride, and this is when the economy was white hot in this part of the world. And the reason it was because it was so much was happening in anticipation of the Panama Canal. So as the Panama Canal had failed originally when the French were building it, everybody thought it was just a pipe dream. It would never happen. And they failed because of malaria and mosquitoes. They couldn't control that. But in 1906, Teddy Roosevelt went down to Panama, and he was a very popular president. He lent his personal prestige to finishing that project, the largest construction project in the world. That kicked off a boom in Western Canada and the Western United States that was unprecedented because once the canal opened, it would cut the shipping time in half. It would cause goods to move more quickly. It would just open up trade on a worldwide basis. So this became the hottest place in the world to invest. And the British investment flowed to the west coast of Canada, and of course, American investment flowed to the west coast of the States. Hooper was in his glory because this is what an architect needs is money to build and clients. So boy, did he have clients all of a sudden. There's in this promotional booklet that he put together in 1910, there's his office staff, and actually there's a couple of interesting people here. Raphael Nicolais was a talented architect in his own right who went on to have his own practice. J.Y. McCarter, you may have heard of McCarter and Nairn, who designed the Marine Building, George Medical Dental Building, downtown post office. McCarter trained directly under Hooper. We've got Ferre had his own career later on, and R.T. Garrow right there designed the Hotel Georgia later, had a career in Seattle. Robert Wilson was Hooper's partner later on, and John McCall was actually one of Hooper's brothers-in-law who worked in the business. One of the buildings he designed was the Winch Building, which is part of Sinclair Center downtown, and you're now seeing the full-on flight of the Edwardian era, the classical revival styles that Hooper now embraced for his commercial and institutional projects. Houses were different. Houses did not follow this style. They tended to follow an arts and crafts inspiration. This, however, was Hooper's favored idiom, the classical revival now. And you see the power of this entirely granite facade. This is not a cheap building. Beautifully furnished throughout, and complete with stained glass dome. Keep your eye on the domes for the next little while. BC Permanent, later the Bank of Canada on Pender Street in Vancouver, is still very much in existence today. I actually just completed the restoration work on the building, and the interior is surprisingly intact on this building. If you ever get a chance to see it, it's stunning, complete with stained glass dome, which is similar to what would have been in the Royal Bank in Victoria, but unfortunately it's gone. This is one that survived. And as part of the excavation of layers and later material, lo and behold, the original marble mosaic floor appeared under a whole bunch of later crap. And to our surprise, this little dancing fish, almost Escher-esque pattern started to emerge and has now been restored. Wonderful find in that building. But Hooper designed churches, lots of churches, just prolific in a way that it's hard to imagine how he could have kept this many projects going. Methodist Church in Mount Pleasant, and a beautiful, this one is still there, it's the 6th Avenue Methodist in New Westminster, a beautiful building, and unusual in its use of concrete block. And this is a clue to things that are leading me in different directions as we're doing further research and looking for more buildings. There was a David Spencer store in Chilliwack made of concrete block. Is that a Hooper project? Don't know. Haven't found that connection yet. But certainly by 1912 he was using that material, which was a manufactured material and a cheap alternative to stone. Hospitals like St. Joseph's in Victoria, which is still there. Commercial buildings, that's the Lou building at the top, the Val building, the Sunrise Hotel, which is just being restored now, and Drysdale building, which is demolished. And of course the Pither and Lizer building in Victoria, a landmark on the Inner Harbor. Always was surprised by this project, the west wing of St. Anne's in St. Anne Academy in Victoria. Unusual, and you kind of wonder why he designed this addition to the building to look like this, to the earlier 1880s building. Well, the reason was, we found the drawings, that's what they were going to do. Again, Hooper was really moving towards, and this was in 1908, this whole classical revival idiom of grandiose proportions, something we really hadn't seen in BC up till that time. And when you look at the details of this, you see the incredible conception that was going on here, that they had the money to build, and they were starting these great, huge projects. What was also happening at the time was administratively the province was growing, and it was growing fast. There was, in 1908, the University Act was passed. We didn't have a university before then, of course. The government was expanding, and certainly the court system was expanding. And as that is a provincial responsibility, the province was building courthouses all over the place. So you would know the current building that's the Vancouver Art Gallery. This is it. The original building was designed by Francis Rattenbury in 1906. There were delays getting the building opened. It didn't open until 1911. When it opened, they had already started construction on the west wing, which Thomas Hooper designed. So they didn't go back to Rattenbury, they went to Hooper. And there was to be an east wing. If you ever wonder why it's kind of an asymmetrical composition, an east wing was actually designed but never built. So Hooper all of a sudden had the contract to design all the courthouses for the province of BC. Yikes. That's a plum job. So he did Revelstoke as well. Still very much there. Cornerstone laid May 2nd. We don't see Hooper in the photo because he was undoubtedly running around somewhere else. He had so many projects going in 1912, it's almost impossible to track them. And of course the wonderful coat of arms in the stained glass. These are beautifully detailed buildings, wonderful buildings. He was also retained to do the Vernon Courthouse as well. Again, a massive granite building in the classical style. Here's the Scottish stonemasons all there working on the building. Building's going up, and there's the building. And I find this building absolutely astonishing. The power, the simplicity. You can see where he's taken this classical idiom from this building we're in to this temple of justice. Remarkable. But meanwhile, the firm was also cranking out residential buildings of all descriptions for all kinds of clients, including the Pooley residence in Esquimalt, which still exists. And you see, again here, we're not doing classical revival here, we're doing Tudor revival. How interesting. But that's what clients wanted. They wanted to go to their temple of commerce and work away in a different environment than what they wanted to live in. And this was very much a great part of the firm's work. There's Chris Spencer, who we knew for many years, and he did so much work for the Spencers. It's amazing. He did all their stores, from what I can tell. He also designed Chris Spencer's house, which was at 49th and East Boulevard in Vancouver. It was at what was called McGee Station, which was the McGee stop on the interurban. This was a grand home. I remember it being demolished when I was quite young, and crawling through it and looking at the fabulous fireplace tiles and the inlaid floors and thinking, wow, this is a shame this has to go. But it did. The stone wall is still there. But we do have one that did survive, which is its kind of country cousin, Eden Bank in Chilliwack, which was designed for A.C. Wells. And Hooper, again, had done Wells's earlier house, 1897. He had repeat clients all the time, and I think that really speaks to how he worked as an architect. But he was very consistent, gave good service, and remained friends with many of his clients. So there's Mr. Hoop in 1911. Now, he's made lots of money. You can imagine that as an architect to have that much work and that much going on, he's done pretty well. But he's traveling back and forth, and you can see he's restless. The caption is, "I don't know where I'm going, I'm looking for new ideas." And I think, again, that's indicative of the way that he actually worked and thought. He was always looking for inspiration and bringing that back into his work. So he did travel back and forth to New York quite a bit. He did travel to Europe with Chris Spencer. And ultimately, of course, he did move to New York for 12 years. At the time, as I mentioned, the family was very close. And at the time that he was supervising this building, news came that his brother Samuel had died in London. He had bronchial problems, went to London for treatment and didn't survive, leading to yet another trip to a graveyard to follow up on the Hoopers of Winnipeg and Manitoba. This was a very big personal blow to Hooper, who was very close to his family, and to his brother. This was also the time of his greatest productivity. 1912 was the boom year. It was the big boom year. Everything was cascading towards this crescendo of construction, of craziness, of investment. And 1912 was when it happened. There was construction going on pretty much 24 hours a day in Vancouver and Victoria. Hooper was in the thick of it. This is the date stone from the winch building in Victoria at the Gladding and McBean factory in Lincoln, California. And Gladding McBean has been making terracotta since the 1870s and is still in business. A number of years ago, they donated all their glass slide negatives to the California State Public Library. 10,000 of them or something, and in some of these projects we actually have the glass plate negatives for the terracotta work that was done. The winch building facade still exists. This was one of the real treats, finding this one. Hooper designed the Campbell building in Victoria, but originally designed it to have big terracotta moose heads, but somewhere along the line decided that a camel would be more appropriate on the Campbell building, and ended up this is unbelievable. So a pun on the owner's name, and these camel heads, the building's been demolished, there's a couple of the camel heads still around, but just how fun, to do that. And there was so much work going on, and I think they were just having a great time with it. This terracotta shot is from the Royal Bank that is now Go Ballet on Main Street. And I find this absolutely astonishing. They're taking this kind of ionic plus composite capital, but totally abstracting it. Really, really working through kind of it. You can see they're getting into a different phase. They're not just quoting classical motifs. They're actually really starting to invent things here. He had very talented people working for him, and he was a very talented architect. But Hooper's big downfall also happened in 1912. That was the year of the competition for the University of British Columbia. As I mentioned, the University Act had passed in 1908. The Point Grey campus had been chosen. There were 3 potential locations. Mary Hill in Coquitlam, to be beside the insane asylum at Riverview, Essendale. The North Shore, because the bridge or tunnel was surely to be built almost immediately. 1912, took a few years. And Point Grey. And one of the reasons that Point Grey was chosen, because it had lots of open land, and of course at that point UBC was an agricultural college in nature. So there was a competition held, and again, this is the time of great plans. There was a very large planning process, architectural competition for Riverview / Essendale in 1912 as well. The University of BC, this was a huge competition, and one of the judges was Samuel McClure. And everybody was expecting that this would be a very English kind of institution, and I think everybody kind of expected that. Well, that is not what Hooper produced in his competition drawings, and they are an astonishing document to see. They're in the UBC special collections. So some of this survived. When you see this, I think you will see that Hooper actually was now really starting to get out of step with the way that people were starting to think. He saw this as a chance to design a grand classical campus. Very Beaux-Arts, axial, linear, classical, domes, you name it. This was like going to be something else, and here you go, bang. Like, can you imagine if UBC actually looked like this? Wow. Hooper's obviously been to Venice. So the judges took one look at this stuff and went, ooh, sorry, Thomas. The comments were absolutely acrid. You can kind of pick them up with tongs about one of the applicants who's misunderstood the intent of the competition by submitting a palatial series of designs. Clearly, he wasn't going to win that competition. Instead, we got Sharp and Thompson, who gave the judges what they wanted, which was this kind of lumpen Gothic kind of thing, English to the core, not what Hooper was selling. This is when things fell apart in his career, not just because of this, but by October 1912, things were starting to happen. Grand projects were being announced, but not realized. Things started looking a little shaky. Commodity prices dropped. Tin, metal, of all kind, lumber prices dropped. Things didn't look too good, and everybody thought, well, it's just the fall. By spring, it'll pick up. Well, by spring, the Hell's Gate slide had happened, killing the salmon industry. There was a full-blown financial crisis. Banks started closing down, and this was actually a global crisis. It was one of the triggers of World War I. So from October 1912 till August of 1914, there was this big, long slide where everything went on hold, sort of like 2008, if you remember what that was like. And architectural projects were shut down all over the province. And as a matter of fact, Sharp and Thompson's designs for the library did not get built from 1912 until 1924. So Hooper, who had this big office and no work, shut it down in 1915 and went to New York, which is where his career effectively pretty much ends, certainly the scale of career that he'd had. Here he is in New York in probably 18, because Rebecca's not there, with his brother Martin and Martin's wife Effie. Hooper's getting old, right? And so this would have been when he had left while he still had money. And this was one of the great mysteries. We never could figure out what happened to Rebecca, and the family was very vague and didn't really know. And it turned out the answer was in Emerson, where there was indeed a headstone for Rebecca. She had died in New York. By all accounts, had never been overly robust or healthy. So once she died, Hooper went back and forth to Europe with Chris Spencer every year, and kind of lived his life, and doesn't really seem to have worked. But in 1927, the money appears to have run out. So he came back to Vancouver. And the family was delighted to see Uncle Thomas. There he is with his nephews from one side of the family surrounding him. And he tried to start work again. But he was so out of step, and it was so a different world at that point. He designed mostly residential buildings. This was designed for a family member, Langford Godfrey. It's a house in North Vancouver that still exists. And he apparently he worked on the Benjamin Franklin Hotel in Seattle, back and forth a little bit, but really it wasn't a serious return to work. His health was giving out. He had heart problems. There he is in about 1934. He lived with his family, the McCalls, until about 1934, went into a home at that point because of poor health, and died on January 1st, 1935 of a heart attack. I talked to one relative who said, I remember Uncle Thomas really well. He helped me learn to drive. He always kind of looked tweedy, was what she said. So by that point, you can see he's got his big tweed coat and his hat, and he's looking pretty happy. By all accounts, a kind man to his family, and they returned that kindness in his old age. But his career was effectively over. But what we have left is a legacy of the most extraordinary buildings from a time period in British Columbia's growth that are a wonderful thing to have. They're buildings that speak of a time and an age that was so proud and so prosperous and was growing and doing things that are hard to imagine. They were building institutions from scratch. They were founding cities. They were making progress into the 20th century. And as we look back now, over 100 years on many of these buildings, it's amazing how many of them there are that have survived. And it's been a pleasure to study and look at the work of Thomas Hooper as a representative of that time period and that wonderful flowering of architecture in this incredible way, kind of little gems that were planted, that some of which we can still enjoy, like this building. So thank you very much for being here tonight. Thank you. Yeah, absolutely. Sure, yeah. Whew, I did that without taking a breath.
Thank you so much, Don. And, you know, I have to tell you, we had a number of people calling this week saying, is Thomas Hooper going to be there?
A relative is here.
That's right. And I feel like you have actually made Hooper present here tonight in a way. So
I've been channeling.
That's right. So I wonder if there's any who might have some questions for Don. Feel free.
There's one over there. Yeah. Going.
Yes, the Methodist Church in Vancouver that you suggested started its career. Was that the old Wesley Methodist that came down in 31?
No. Homer Street Methodist was at 411 Dunsmuir, and it was where it was torn down in 1911, and Hooper designed the building that replaced it, the Labor Temple, that is still there. Wesley Methodist was over on Burrard Street, designed 1898-ish, reaching now by William Blackmore, but different building. Lots of Methodists, right? Yeah. There's a whole bunch of questions over here. Yes, please.
Donald, you'll be pleased to know that Carmen United Church, the old part, is still there.
It is?
Yes.
Oh, okay.
In fact, we're loyalists here. We have our Heritage Week celebration. That's where we have our meetings, and it's my church as well. So the hall is what used to be the schoolroom, and the other is the lounge. And then it was in 1958 that they built the sanctuary in front. So I can go up into the attic and see all sorts of things.
I'm
where it connected.
thrilled to hear that.
Yeah,
Wow,
so
okay, thank you.
It wasn't taken down.
It wasn't taken
looks
down.
like, but you can't tell.
I hadn't seen it, yeah.
But I do remember the church and going in and being part of the church when it was like it used to be.
Wow, fantastic. Well, that's really interesting. Thank you.
So I thought you'd be pleased to know
I'm
that
thrilled.
it's still
Yeah.
there.
Yeah. A hidden gem.
Well,
Great.
1898 is a long time.
Yeah.
It's over. It's still very much used.
Excellent. That's great. Yes, ma'am.
I was wondering, what were the business addresses that Hooper used in Victoria and Vancouver during his heyday, when things were really booming, say up to about 1910?
He had an office in the Winch Block.
He was in the...
He was in the Winch Block for years, and then in Victoria, no, in Vancouver.
Oh, the Winch one, okay.
Yeah, which is now Sinclair Centre.
Right.
In Victoria, his office was in the Five Sisters Block, which burned in 1910. And the Five Sisters Block, which was also where McClure had his offices, Rattenbury had his offices. They all lost their plans. This is one of the reasons there's none of the early records that survive. There's a story about when the Five Sisters Block burned, that Hooper had the drawings for the Vancouver courthouse up there. So he was trying to run back in to the fire to get them, and they wouldn't let him in. They kind of chucked him out, and one of his employees barely made it out. But you can imagine seeing your life's work and drawings and all that burning down. You know, it was a huge loss for all of them. And by all accounts, they had to kind of cooperate to get projects completed, and then all of a sudden there was another fire, so that much more to build, right? And he had 3 or 4 projects that came right out of that fire zone. I didn't really mention that he probably wouldn't have cooperated with Rattenbury. They were deadly rivals, and it was personal because when Rattenbury was taken to court for misappropriating things from the legislature for his house, I don't know if you know the story, but Rattenbury's house has the most amazing kitchen and pantry you've ever seen in your life, lined with inch-thick marble floor to ceiling, and just amazing. Well, it kind of matches what's in the Parliament buildings, and there's a fireplace in the dining room that matches what's in the Parliament buildings, and it appears that the truck stopped on the way, and Mr. Rattenbury, who was in his own way an extremely interesting fellow, they were all, not unusual. You talk to the contractor, slip him a few bucks, and something drops off the truck, right? So he got caught, and there was an inquiry, and Hooper testified against him. And at that point, everybody was kind of iffy about Rattenbury to begin with because they were so jealous of him getting the contract for the Parliament buildings. This was the final straw. So Hooper and Rattenbury were very deadly enemies. By all accounts, Hooper was really, other than that, well regarded in the profession and trained many of the people who were coming up through the profession at that time. But yeah, Five Sisters block, all gone. So the one thing that we had, one of the strongest pieces of documentation we had from Hooper was when the AIBC, the Architectural Institute, was formed in 1920. So in 1921, everybody had to register and pay fees to be licensed as an architect. And everybody filled out these membership forms, and usually they're pretty cursory, like, par and fee, kind of wrote down, we've done hundreds of buildings, well, thanks for that, Hooper sat down and typed out a list of about 120 buildings at that point, and that's the core of what we started with when we started looking for buildings. By no means all, but that was really strong evidence. Yeah. But nothing much else survived.
Just two questions, man.
Yeah.
Did Mr. Hooper involve himself in building many schools? And if so, was he involved in the 1912 Chilliwack High School?
So he did lots of schools, including one of the early schools in Vancouver, now torn down in Strathcona. He did Sardis School and Rosedale School, and he also probably did what we not got the evidence yet, the high school, the concrete block one. Suspect we haven't found anybody else connected to it. So, but he did. One of his first projects in Vancouver was supervising Central School, which is where VVI is now, or Vancouver Community College. So yes, absolutely. Yeah.
Secondly, I'm wondering how common it was to make an alteration in the original plan, so that you can see the difference between the original plan and the building here. Because in the slide that showed about 30 or 40 back, there was no right-hand side stairway.
Oh, that was just a cutaway on the drawing. But what happened historically for buildings like this, they're done with 5 or 6 or 7 sheets of drawings for a building of this complexity, which today would probably require 200. The reason that the plans tend to be so simplified and that they would actually evolve from the design to construction was that the builders who were building them knew exactly what they were doing, and they were master builders. They were just as trained as the architects, and the architects were trained as builders too. So you would assume a lot of the details would be carried out by the builders. So, and variations happen from the plans. There's many examples of that. We often find sets of original plans, and it's like, what happened here? Well, they just kind of, the architect would be working with the builder, and it still happens today that you make changes on site. So depending on the building, you would see that happen. On houses, that was generally one sheet of drawings. Even really, really complicated houses, 2 or 3. So if you can imagine that how much interpretation would occur between the design and the building of it, it's pretty amazing. It's very different than today. Yeah. Yeah. Yes.
I see this building was built by J.C. Robertson. Were they a big contractor, or did they do other
Pretty.
building jobs?
Yeah, they were local. They were, yeah.
They were local.
Yeah. Yeah. And the other thing I should point out here as well, which is really important in understanding this building, is this is really early for concrete. Right? This is I mean, people weren't building all concrete buildings at the time, right? I mean, this was one of the very first in Vancouver was the Hotel Europe in Gastown. 1908 to 1909 was one of the first concrete frame buildings in the city. This is an extraordinary little exploration of technology, actually. Yeah. Yes, ma'am. There's one. Okay, yeah.
You just mentioned that the Architectural Institute about 1921 formed an association.
1920.
20, and Mr. Hooper provided a major list of
Yeah.
his.
Buildings at that point, yeah.
Do you know what time the architecture school at UBC was established? Is that
1946.
about- not till 46?
Yeah, so what happened, that one of those first pictures I showed of Hooper, member of, there had been attempts, when we were working on building the West, we found we couldn't tell the story of the architects without telling the story of the profession, which had never been researched. So I had the delightful job of digging through all the membership files, transcribing them, which has been an invaluable resource, but also understanding what happened. And there was a 30-year process. BC was one of the last provinces to regulate architects. And the reason for that was the local architects were so unwilling to cooperate, and there were so many people pouring into the province who wanted to call themselves architects who clearly were not qualified. And there was a raging battle that happened over 3 decades. Hooper was pro-registration and pro-professionalization. He was on the original BC Society of Architects, which was a loosely formed group that was trying to get the province to regulate the profession in the early 1890s. And then that all kind of fell apart because of the booms and bust cycles. People were leaving. And 2 organizations were founded, BC Society of Architects and the Architectural Institute of British Columbia, 2 rival organizations. And the BC Society faded away during the First World War when all the members went off to war. And there were 10 members of the AIBC that stayed together and got the province to pass the act in 1920. So it was unregulated until 1920. It was unbelievable. But anyway, I mean, yeah. So, yeah, great. And then one question back there, and then there was one over there. Yeah.
Do you have a record that he was Methodist?
I think he was conveniently Methodist. And if I remember correctly,
In the closet,
yeah.
kind of in the attic kind of thing?
Well, I think they.
I'm a church goer too, so I'm
Yeah.
just wondering, what about the chorus girls? Can you tell?
Well, what I understand is when Hooper died, he was listed as Methodist on his death certificate. But I suspect they started off Anglican, right? And so I think he, again, he worked for all denominations. I mean, that wasn't a surprise. And I think a good, competent architect was something that, the churches were interested in. The chorus girl comment comes from members of the family who, when he was traveling with Chris Spencer, there was all kinds of stories that they loved to party it up. And They mentioned chorus girls, so I just let my imagination play with that. So I don't know of any specific, but I'm sure you can just see the two of them out on the town buying champagne and carrying on, even if it was innocent. But yeah, I mean, and at that point, Hooper was also traveling with Spencer after his wife passed away as well. So he can be forgiven that one. Yeah. Okay. Yeah.
But I wanted to ask, this is all intriguing, but I wanted to ask, where did you get the materials to build these buildings? Like the stained glass?
Right.
Were they made, or did you get them, somebody and all this
Yeah.
different materials? Because that's intriguing to me of how, to design it is one thing, but how did it go from point A to point B? And where did you get all the materials to make them?
Yeah. Great question, and it depends really on the time period. So BC, when Hooper started his career in the 1880s, anything finished would have been imported. Glass, hardware, anything manufactured. We had the raw materials. We had the wood. We had we could make bricks, although a lot of bricks were originally imported. So the finer stuff, the detailed stuff, usually came from England. And the reason that it did was all these architects were British trained, and so that was the source. And of course the ships were coming in, so shipping coming in was very cheap because you had to ballast the boats coming in. So getting stuff from England was not expensive. So lots of stuff came in that way. And ultimately, later, a lot more came from the States. But there's lots of stories I know, not to do with the Hooper building, but a McClure building, the Overlyn in Burnaby. It's well documented that the stained glass came from England in barrels of molasses. That's how they shipped it. It would be dunked in the barrel and it would roll around in the liquid and show up, and they'd pull it out and hose it off and install the stained glass. So much of it did come from England.
There's one question, did his father have a stone or masonry company or something?
No, his father was never involved in the building trades, which is unusual because the two uncles were, and then Thomas and his brother Samuel were involved in the building trades, and it is a family profession, but the problem being that, again, usually the first son or the first and second son tended to go into the family profession. So certainly we know that Thomas and Samuel were exposed to that. They were still pretty young when they were in England, but it was in the family, but the father was not. No.
I thought I said something about masonry.
Yes, no, that was the brother, Samuel. He was not only an architect, he was a very accomplished sculptor, and he actually had a stone yard for a while and carved, if you know Winnipeg at all, there's a number of his monuments that he produced. Yeah.
So did his brother give him the supplies to build these buildings?
There was not that kind of connection after Thomas moved to the coast. Yeah. Yeah, thanks.
Would have been free, I suppose.
Yes.
Did his brother build anything
In Winnipeg, lots, yes. He was extremely prolific, and there's a ton of Samuel Hooper's buildings still around. Not the Parliament buildings, but the building that's now City Archives, for example. He was provincial architect. He did all the other government buildings. Yeah, but he died in 1911, so he didn't design the Parliament buildings. But no, he had an incredibly prolific career as well, quite unusual. And actually, their brother James Hooper was the King's printer in Manitoba. Yeah. They were practicing in a similar style. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. Okay.
Well, I think that we have all open the doors to something here which is going to continue to intrigue us. And I think we're just all now in Chilliwack. I think there's at least 100 people who are going to buy the Thomas Hooper book.
So I have to write it. There we go.
So, thank you again.
Darn, Matthew. What have you started?
I would like to present you on behalf of the Chilliwack Museum and Historical Society with a copy of the Chilliwack story.
Oh, fantastic. Thank you.
We really appreciate you being here tonight. Thank you so
Okay.
So thanks again, Don.
Good, thank you.
Please feel free to stay, chat, have a coffee, tea, enjoy some snacks, and let's continue digging in to some of these great stories that make up our community. Thank
Great.
you.
Thanks, guys. Thanks. Just gonna, here we go. So I don't trip. There we go.
We recorded it.
I'm recording.